Hi, I'm Andrew MacLaren.
And I'm Mark Ridley.
Welcome to the Teamcraft podcast,
where we talk about the tradecraft and sometimes the witchcraft of what it means to work together in a team. Our guest today is Andrew MacLaren. For those of you who have been following the series, you'll know that Andrew is the co-host of the Teamcraft podcast. Over the previous episodes, we've been joined by an amazing group of people with stories to tell about teams, but we haven't really investigated the experience of one of our most interesting experts. Andrew, or to give him his full title, Dr. Andrew MacLaren, is an award-winning university lecturer based at the Cruise Research Centre at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. His research is principally concerned with the sociolinguistics of teamwork, how teams communicate. Some of the amazing teamwork projects he's been involved in include astronaut communication in deep space exploration and the communication processes of healthcare teams in trauma scenarios. He has researched and authored textbooks and articles on subjects from the British Army in Afghanistan, professional kitchen teams, and startup investing. Before entering academia, Andrew spent 10 years working as a tennis coach, and as you'll hear in today's episode, he still sees a tennis court as his spiritual home. You'll also hear about the dysfunction of teams in academia, the expert paradox and how it impacts team decision-making, the importance of language as a non-technical team skill, and the risks caused by the newness of teams. Over to Andrew.
I research and teach in areas of teamwork. So that's my absolute passion, my interest, and I am researching and teaching in the way teams talk to each other. That's both inside a team and potentially between teams. I suppose you say that would be the thread that would run through different research projects that I'm working on, would be that there's a common focus on language and team communication. And I have what I would describe as a communication constitutive view of teamwork. I consider the performance of talking in a team to be part of what brings a team into being. And that might sound, okay, that's perfectly acceptable. I don't disagree with that. But there's maybe a slightly different view of things like communication in teams that would say, okay, talking to each other, communication, is something that a team does in order to perform good teamwork. It's a means to an end. And my perspective and what I'm interested in looking at in my research is, well, I start from looking through the lens of the idea that, well, you are talking your way into existence. So what you say to each other in the material practice and the day-to-day enactment of teamwork, that is constitutive of the team and the teamwork. So it's not just part of the background scenery, it literally is part of the substance of what makes a team.
Just talking about your journey a little bit more, you're currently a lecturer in a university, and I did an undergrad degree. So my knowledge of academia is literally what the inside of the coffee shop and the bar looks like at my university. And my entire time at university is pretty much concentrated on this ticking clock of how many days I had left until I could get out and go to work. So I'm not very familiar with what the other side of academia looks like.
I think the first thing to say is that it slightly depends on discipline. I studied at Strathclyde Business School and I ended up doing a lot of research earlier in my career. I went from my undergrad into a Master of Research, and then from that I got a scholarship to do a PhD. Kind of a bit like you, I didn't know much other than the inside of a bar for most of my undergraduate degree, to be quite honest. I was also working more or less full-time as a tennis coach as I was doing my undergraduate and actually my master's. So I would say that I wasn't particularly sure of what direction I was going to take during my undergraduate, or once I got towards the end of my undergraduate and I got my teeth into doing a dissertation and found that the process of conducting research really interested me and did well in my undergraduate and had the opportunity to go and do a master's. And I suppose that was a sort of like, right, I'll see what that's like. And I got involved in a bit of research as well. So actual published research, and it was stimulating. So I got the opportunity to be funded through a PhD, and I went for it. The process in academia is a bit of a messy one, I would say. And it does somewhat boil down to, if I can really, really over reduce it, it's a trifecta of politics, publishing, and PhD. I didn't intentionally go for a little alliteration of 3Ps there, but it is that. You need a PhD because it's a bit like getting your driver's license. It's completing an apprenticeship, whatever analogy you want to give, gives you that chartership of, right, you can handle serious research, you can take it to completion, all that stuff. Politics, jobs are reasonably scarce, funding is difficult to come by, so you need to be in the system and meet people, I guess, and people need to know who you are, and therefore you might get, nowadays it's like a short-term contract on a research project that may lead for you to some publications, but also gets people inside departments to know who you are, inside research centres. And yeah, that's the third P, is publishing, is you need to have some published work with your name on it that demonstrates your kind of, I guess you could call it market value. Don't like talking about it in such commoditized terms, but there is an element of that, and that should hopefully lead you to that first rung on the ladder, which is your first academic post.
There's a couple of things I want to come back to. I want to come back to the tennis coach, because there are some fantastic stories there. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about was your passion is teams. So obviously you light up when you talk about teams and when you talk about team communication. I'm really curious about how teamwork is demonstrated in academic circles. I know that you've co-authored papers, so you're talking about that journey, you're co-authoring papers, but also you're part of university, I guess you're part of a department, you're even part of a temporary team, I guess, when you're with your students. What are the obvious teams that you are part of? What are the collaborations that you have where you're actually experiencing teamwork, not theorizing it, not teaching it, but actually living it?
So I think I have quite a negative role model reference in academia for teams. And there are lots of influences in my life that I think have led me to really find teamwork and the dynamics of teamwork as stimulating and as energizing as I find it. But in academia, I'd say my experiences have been pretty negative overall. And that doesn't mean that it's negative everywhere, but my experience in research collaboration, I would identify as one of the things that made me so interested in researching teamwork, was how awful some of the experiences I had earlier in my career were around about who gets the credit, what collaboration really means, how work is distributed, the sense of support and care and compassion and a climate of feeling valued, how all of that influences the deadlines that you're working under, the pressure you're working under, the workload. Essentially, most of my experience of that was quite negative. I don't think I'm overstating it to say that although my experiences were probably particularly bad, that academia has a reasonably bad reputation for effective teamwork. I mean, there is a team science, there's a whole area of interest in researching teams of researchers now, which wasn't given much attention up until relatively recently. And it's a reasonably unhealthy professional culture, I would say, that self-perpetuates, because what you have is a setup which is, okay, at its real worst, you could describe it as a bad pyramid scheme, or even worse, a structure of kind of trickle-down abuse, which is you've got a high-powered professor at the top who has a reputation and a name which creates a field of a force of gravitational pull for funding, and that funding allows things like PhD students to be funded through their studies. Those PhD students become sort of indentured into that system, and the outputs that they create, the big professor's name goes on those outputs. And the only way for those PhD students to get on is to continue to slave away in that system till eventually they rise high enough to the point that they're attracting their own funding, and they perpetuate that back down again.
That's not a very rosy outlook, but the one question pops straight into my head is it that by nature the field is individualistic and doesn't require teamwork? You and I, through this series, have spoken to a lot of people where effective teamwork is a necessity. Some people where it relates to company performance, but some people where lives are on the line. When you think about your experiences, do you think that it's just that you can get away with that structure? Because these things are all organic, right? Academia is an institution that has existed for thousands of years. These things have been around for a very long time. It is institutionalized, but it's institutionalized with what sounds like really bad team performance, which shouldn't be allowed to happen through evolution, but it still exists. Is it just that it is primarily individualistic and teamwork isn't a really big deal, or is it perpetuated through some other means?
I'd always caveat what I'm saying with the fact that I also know of really good examples and really healthy teams and really successful partnerships or small groups of people who consistently put work out together. And I don't know what goes on the inside, but certainly on the face of it, say that's a healthy, successful, positive example of a team. Yeah, I think some of it is down to maybe the uncertain nature of what research is. There is a parallel with entrepreneurship, right? Which is the very nature of being involved in research is that you're literally nudging the boundary of knowledge along. And that in itself it can't be anything but uncertain. It can't be anything but wrought with, false summits, cul-de-sacs, disappointments. And there needs to be someone who's insightful, innovative, creative thinking is the fuel that's moving that process along. And so that in itself, that might be an individual, it might be a small group of individuals who share similar views and ideas, but that in itself requires a sort of force of personality, I guess. And that force needs to bring people on who subscribe to it, who share that same belief. And that force of personality, for want of anything else, also needs to attract funding to enable them to do things. And I think it's reasonably easy for the ambient uncertainty, the ambiguity, and the requirement for, people who are thinking differently, the combination of all of that can mean that taking a step back and going, is everyone okay? Is everyone on the same page here? The necessity for a sort of sense of safety and security and making sure everyone's totally fine and looked after, it becomes very far down the priority list. So I think to some extent it is individualistic, but yeah, there's usually someone who's, as an individual, thinking differently and needing to try and bring people along with them. The counterpoint to all of that is that certainly in STEM subjects, for example, you don't achieve any of that progress really on your own. It requires labs and technicians and an army of people. But going back to my original point, the reality is that a lot of those people don't tend to get very much credit, recognition, or proportionate appreciation in the process. I think there's also a Western thing of, I say Western, certainly UK, North America, we do love to have an individual success story. And so at both ends of the process, there's an individualistic boundary put around it, which is at the very top end, we love hero professors. We love, Nobel laureates. we want to give one person a prize, and at the start of the process, a PhD is a very lonely experience. It's you on your own.
Yeah.
It's like I said, it's that apprenticeship where you're trying to demonstrate your own individual capacity to do this quite difficult thing, and you're at the mercy of a supervisory group who are the big professors in your area you've got to live up to their standards. So I guess it's bookended by a sort of isolating experience at the start and a winner takes all approach at the top, and in between there's the shades of that problem.
So it sounds from everything that you've said here that you don't really, as a researcher focusing on teams, want to look inside academia for examples of what great teamwork looks like. And I know that you've spent a lot of time with a lot of different organizations doing that research, speaking to different people. Could you talk through briefly the types of any organization? I was going to say companies, but I know it's not limited to companies. Can you give us a bit of an insight into what your research has covered?
So my research has evolved over my career so far, and yes, some of that's very specific to my what I would call reasonably negative experiences in my earlier career. Some of it's par for the course for junior academics to A, you're trying to learn, so you're trying to get involved in other projects. B, you don't have enough, you've not established yourself enough to be able to say no to some things and focus on what you want. So the thread that probably runs through my earlier research is sort of interest in cultural dynamics. But I've looked at professional kitchens, the dynamics of a professional kitchen brigade, and particularly looking at bullying culture, women's empowerment in Nepal, and how women use entrepreneurship to empower themselves in the Himalayas and the trekking routes in Nepal. Theme park dynamics of people in queues, reality television, the celebrity chefs. So quite a variation. And then more recently looking at identity work and entrepreneurship. So how different groups of people, depending on the type of work they're involved in, construct their identities differently in discourse. So at the moment, I'm working on long distance communication for astronaut crews for the Mars missions. And that's particularly interested in signal latency, communication delay. So how does a team overcome the impact of delay? And if you've ever listened to an interview during the pandemic on dodgy Wi-Fi or on Radio 4 when someone's in America or whatever, and there's a tiny delay, you can see the impact of even the tiniest delay on how we interact with each other. I'm also looking at medical trauma simulation, so looking at how medical teams deal with, that project actually is interested in a couple of things, looking at what's called epistemic uncertainty, or we might call it diagnostic uncertainty. So how does a team work out what's wrong with someone when it's quite acute, heart's not beating fast enough or whatever? How do they confront that? But more particularly, how do they do it as a team? So maybe a bit similarly to that story that I give you of academia, doctors are almost professionalized into this individualist capacity to be a medical professional, and there's nothing wrong with that. They go through medical school, and it's very much about, do you know what you need to know in order to discharge your duties as a clinician? And that's perfectly understandable. You need to be examined on whether you have the capacities and the understanding to do the job. The interesting thing is that the realities in healthcare are that most of the work that they'll engage in is in a team, and very often it's an interprofessional team. So at the very least, it's a doctor and a nurse, or it might be an emergency medicine doctor working with a radiologist, or it could be an orthopedic surgeon, a neurosurgeon, whatever it might be. The nature of the work is interdisciplinary and interprofessional, and those aspects fall under what's called non-technical skills. And those non-technical skills have to be deployed in and around the technical skills in order for them to do the job. The interesting thing for me, going back to what I was saying about, I have this particular perspective on teamwork to do with language constituting the teamwork, is that a doctor cannot deploy their technical skills without non-technical skills. So the only way your technical skills come into use in a scenario where you've got a patient who's crashing the only way they're used is through non-technical skills. So the relationship between non-technical and technical skills is essential. And you're then adding on the layer of, well, how do they confront that uncertainty, that diagnostic uncertainty as a group? So the diagnosis belongs to all the people in the room, but as doctors, they're sort of trained to, they have to work out themselves. They're also bumping up against a conditioning that happens. I don't know the answer to the question, but the thing that we're looking at there in that project is, okay, so how do they go about confronting that issue? How do they engage in teamwork and communication in order to reach a diagnosis? What are the processes? Can we observe what the processes are, and can we suggest ways in which they might be adapted, improved to optimize them, to make them more effective, to make them safer?
So one of the things that I did see in the research that you had looked at, and you mentioned entrepreneurship a couple of times, but you also looked particularly around venture investing.
Yeah.
And that's an area that we both overlap, is effectively around entrepreneurship and around these small teams. So what was the research that you did in venture investing?
Yeah, so that's a project. It's still ongoing. I mean, we've put a bit of research out now from it, but there's still some work ongoing. Long story short, that project is about small group decision making. So it's a team of judges who are making decision on whether to invest money or not in startup businesses, and they're in charge of significant amounts of money for millions of pounds. And the interesting thing about those groups is that they're new teams formed for the process, so they're brought together. And we've done well over 400 hours of observation on it now. It has been amazing to see what happens in language in a way that a group comes together and tries to form a team. And we've been very lucky. The organization that we're doing the research on have allowed us as researchers to start to influence the process. So it's called engaged scholarship or action research. So we have a meeting with them twice a year, and we say, well, these are the things, these are our findings to date. This is what we've observed. We have some suggestions on the basis of that as to how you might make sometimes very, very small changes, but those changes we think will improve or adjust for or diminish the impact of something that would make the process fairer, more transparent, try to counter some of the trends we see in the way that the team speaks to each other and where that goes. So one of the things, for example, that we found was, and we call it the expert paradox, is that what we witness is that the group, because they're dealing with businesses that could be anything from pet food to quantum computing, right? So, and you've got different people with different skills. They're all very experienced in the world of growing, developing, funding businesses, or private investors themselves, so on. What they would often do is they would go through this process of, first of all, they would always establish a hierarchy, and it wasn't an explicit hierarchy. It was, oh yeah, Mark, you're a tech guy. You should take a lead on the tech stuff, which seemed very natural. And it was, you recognize after a bit of time that they don't actually know they're doing it. They're not consciously establishing a hierarchy. It's a sort of natural human thing. I mean, it's very well accounted for in the research that that's a natural thing that all species do. And in this environment where it's quite a prestigious thing to be asked to be involved in, and everyone's successful in their own right, it's a positive, collegiate sort of jostling, mutually respectful. But it's, yeah, you're great at this. Oh, you've been really successful in that. You can do this. But what we saw, the expert paradox, is rather than that being used as a device to optimize the decisions that they're making, what we found was that they would do this polite negotiation and identify experts and then isolate the expert. So you're the tech guy, Mark. You're going to be able to talk to all the tech stuff. So when the tech thing comes up, we look at you, and everyone else is sort of gone, I can't comment on this. And what we found then was that in a judging situation, the isolated tech person or the isolated life sciences person, they didn't need to qualify their opinion. They could just go, yeah, we shouldn't invest in that. And because everyone else had sort of absolved themselves from having a say, instead of putting an expert on a pedestal what you've done is you've isolated the expert and divorced yourselves from the conversation. What you had was a team of, say, 5 people were no longer operating as a team. They'd isolated one individual who didn't need to qualify their position because everyone else had absolved themselves from a stake in the conversation. So that was one thing we were saying. We need to have linguistic devices that bring people back in instead of isolating an expert and leaving them to it, and therefore removing the need for evidencing or substantiating their judgment, their opinion. You have mechanisms of language that bring the other people in. So you'd say, right, this person's been identified as an expert. Great, Mark's a tech expert. This is what he's saying. Then my response as a non-expert would be, okay, Mark, what's the biggest strength and the biggest risk? I don't know what they are. There's no skin in the game in that question, but I know that once you've given me opinion, I can follow up with that question and get you to qualify it. And it forces that person to substantiate their position.
This is the crux of a lot of the discussions that we have and what we're working on together, that isn't a team, it's a group of individuals. But it also reminds me of Edward de Bono's work on the 6 thinking hats, which in a team, you force people to take on specifically different roles to propose, to champion an idea or to challenge an idea. And it's supposed to force people out of that situation where you put somebody on a pedestal. So what I think is fascinating in the discussions we've had is a lot of this research has already been done. Teams are not a new idea. We find a lot of teams aren't functioning well, and a lot of the research is already there. It's just that we're still not necessarily learning and applying the lessons, which is, I think, where your research comes in. You mentioned professional kitchens. The communication inside professional kitchens is fascinating. Inside the medical profession, obviously covered by Matthew Syed when he was talking about black box thinking and the differences between airlines and medicine. And then one of the things that we've discussed this a lot, professional sport and the military, both of those, the teamwork is implicit, but it's much more central to performance in both of those areas. And obviously we're going to have the benefit of talking to people in those areas, in professional sport and in the military. But you have this experience as a tennis coach. And one of the stories that I remember you telling me was about a particular area for improvement that you identified with doubles teams at a local level. I thought that was really, really fantastic because you also contrasted it with airline pilots. Can you talk through that experience you had? You identified this performance issue in teamwork and you sort of brought your own perspective to it.
So tennis is my total love. I'm tennis mad. I love everything about tennis. I've played tennis all my life, and I took a year out after school to qualify as a tennis professional, a tennis coach, and then I worked as a tennis coach. I mean, I really feel it necessary to say I'm not a great tennis player. I just love it. It's just tennis is a massive part of my life, and particularly doubles. Yeah, where those two worlds collided for me was probably a bit further back, where reflecting on it, my interest in teamwork was crystallizing as something that really captured my interest professionally in a research context. And I was, as I've always done, still playing competitive tennis, and the majority of competitive tennis I play, which is not serious, as in it's not Wimbledon, the majority of it is doubles, and that's basically because recreational tennis, if you play doubles, there's more people playing, so it's more accessible. So I've always loved playing doubles, and I guess I realized as well, God, I like playing doubles because I do really enjoy the process of playing in a team. But the two worlds collided for me when it's starting to materialize for me that teamwork is a real focus for me professionally. I play doubles. Doubles is a team sport, and at this point, I'm in my early 30s here. I've played tennis for the best part of 25 years. I don't think it had ever been any coach, anything I'd ever looked at. I don't think anyone had ever really explicitly said to me, doubles is a team sport, you need to play well as a team. I'd always had this assumption of, well, you put two good tennis players, two people, skills-wise, two people who are competent skills-wise together on a court, and there's some broad kind of rules you need to follow about where the best place to put the ball is, and if they both do that well, then they'll win the match. No, it's more than that. It's more than that. It's a team sport. So the thing that I took to doing, I was just curious about, right, so how much of it is a team sport? And so I started analysing the team that I played for. I started analysing our results. I kind of built a database basically, but I took pairs as teams. And that might sound so basic and obvious that it's not worth mentioning, but the reality, and in all of my playing experience, the reality was always you never really treated them as teams. You sort of looked at, right, Mark's got a great serve, and Andrew, he's good at volleying, right? So we'll put them together. They'll play well together. Instead, what I did was, let's look at a pair's results. And what I established was that a pair who played once only together performed 33% less well than a pair that had played. It only took a pair to play twice or more for that change to happen. And you can explain some of that by the fact that sometimes when you get data for a pair that played once only, the reason they're playing once only is because it was a stopgap. It was, filling in for an injured person, whatever. Again, without doing all the due diligence, the effect still really is there, even if you account for that. So it demonstrated to me that, well, when you treat it as a team sport, the teams that play together win more often. There's this, significant effect. If you're talking about playing a best of 3 sets match, a 33% improvement can be the difference between winning and losing the match. Yeah, so I ran the numbers over multiple seasons for my team, and I basically said to them, guys, we're really underpowering our performance because we're taking quite a random approach to who's available. So sometimes we would be playing the same group of players, because you have team matches, a team of 6 people who are playing 3 doubles rubbers in that match. We sometimes be playing the same 6 people but in different pairings, and it kind of ran, all right, we'll play them together this week, see how they get on, as opposed to going, we know if they play together more often, they're more likely to win. So I call them one-hit wonders, one pair wonders. People who play just once together, they don't play very well. And the interesting thing is that there's a parallel in aviation. So NTSB, National Transport Safety Board in America, commissioned this research. And again, long story short, the vast majority of serious accidents, so that's an accident that involves either loss of equipment, i.e. the plane, or loss of life, or both. In 73% of those accidents, the pilots who were flying the plane were flying together for the first time. So I ended up finding this neat parallel with something marginally more serious than recreational doubles in Scotland, which is, flying planes. If you're a one-hit wonder, you are exposed to a large degree of failure.
It's interesting to try and understand how far that impact goes, but effectively what that is suggesting, and I realise we're a long way away from a proved theory here, but what it's suggesting is that the impact of being a team is stronger than putting the constituent parts of the team together. So instead of it just being, here is somebody that is good at serving, here is somebody that is good at volleying, let's put them together, and we're maximising the individual capabilities. We're actually saying it is almost more important that those team members have played together before.
Yeah.
So did you get any insight from that about what it was that was improving? What was different between the one-hit wonder? Had they learnt to communicate? Was there something specific that they did? Were they more at ease with each other? Was it the communication? Was it the personal style? What was it?
It's a bit of a cop-out answer. It's a combination of all those things. I think you learn what people's preferences are. So it could take a very basic one in tennis, like you got left-handers and right-handers. So depending on whether you're serving on the juice court or the advantage court, your serve is naturally swinging one way or the other, and it's learning very simple things like, that person's more comfortable on that side doing this kind of serve, and where they serve impacts where the other person stands and where they go when the opposition returns the ball. And you can't really learn that in theory. You sort of have to experience them doing it in a match. Some people get really tight when they're up and they're about to win a game. Some people get really tight when they're down and they're on the brink of losing a game. So knowing how to compensate for that and work together. And so basic things like learning to communicate with each other. Surprise, surprise, I come back to communication, given that it's what I'm interested in. But the thing that fascinates me about tennis is, in a tennis match, when you do have to talk to each other a bit during a point, but you won't communicate that much during a point. You might be, stay where you are, or whatever. But between the points, you've got about 20 seconds to speak to each other. What do you do with those 20 seconds? And if you don't know each other that well, you're probably just going to be polite. If you miss, you're probably going to spend the 20 seconds apologizing for missing. And that's I actually say that to my friends at my club and the people I play with. I'm like, the worst thing you can do between points is apologize to each other. Because coming back to teams they're a group of interdependent people who are united around the same goal. The nice thing about a tennis match, the nice thing about a football match or any sport is the goal is salient. We both want to beat the opponents, or we both want to perform well. If it's a different type of sport, but in tennis, we both want to beat the opponents. So I don't need you to apologize, because I assume when you were trying to hit the shot, you were trying to fulfill our objective, which was to beat the opponents.
Yeah.
The fact that you missed doing it, I have no problem with. If you use your 20 seconds to apologize, you've wasted the time. You could be talking about what you're going to do next. You could be building each other up. You could be discussing something that you've recognized in the opponents that they don't do well. There's not much simulation or prep you can do other than going out into the sort of field of battle and playing together to work some of that stuff out, I think.
So let me give you one more opportunity to introduce a topic before I take you to the quickfire round, which I'm sure you're really going to enjoy. So as you talk about those experiences with those teams, you've literally just said there are basic things, there are little things. It takes 2 matches for these things to improve. Something you and I have spoken about a lot, but I'd love you to actually get to introduce the concept is these teams are okay, but they can make pretty significant gains from small things, which you might think would be a good topic for a book maybe. How do you view that? How do you view the fact that some teams can make these bigger gains from small things?
We, between you and I, referring to that concept as maximal gains, and don't want to call it a counter theory to marginal gains.
It's the other end of the spectrum, right? Because I think marginal gains is definitely a thing, but there is this other end of the spectrum of non-elite teams.
Yeah, it's complementary, I would say. But I guess my example from tennis is an example of maximal gains. Is in my example, nobody was thinking of the doubles pairs as a team. I simply ran the numbers, framing it from the start as, well, these pairs are teams. Let's see how they perform when we look at them as they play together. You would hear talk of statistics, but people would talk about an individual's doubles results. So if you and I play together, it's like Mark's got really good stats, so he's good. He's a good doubles player. But those stats are still relatively valid because, people are still, they have their own abilities on court. And you do see trends. You will see people who they've played with many different partners over the years and they've always done very well. And that's partly because they're really good. But it might be also because they're a particularly good team. They're good at forming teams. But my example of, I framed it as a team, I looked at the numbers, and I found that if you just make sure that you keep pairs together, they have a significant improvement in performance. A 33% improvement in performance, that is not marginal. That's maximal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're talking about recreational amateur tennis here, so we are not elites by any stretch of the imagination. I think these sorts of changes for teams that sit in that enormous middle ground, and I know that you agree with this, changes such as the one that I've given you the example of in a tennis context, changes such as that in any team stand to make really big impacts on the performance of the team. They can look like the sort of things, I also think they can look like the sort of things that marginal gains get framed as. They can look like small things, but they do make a difference. Another example from tennis that I'll use is, again, it's about paying attention, and it's not so much to do with the actual team dynamic, but I talk about tie breaks all the time to my teammates. you know what a tiebreak is. You get 6 games all. You have to play first to 7 points. It's like almost like a penalty shootout in a way. And so that's why I say like it's a penalty shootout. So it's 50-50. So we have to do something that shifts the dial in our direction. It came back to the fact that, well, not many people really ever think about tiebreaks. Oh, right, got to tiebreak, got to 6 games all. I was unlucky to lose that tiebreak. You go, right, well, if you get 6 games all, you're in a penalty shootout situation. You've got to really dial in and see if you can change over the course of a season. If you win more than 50% of the tiebreaks you're involved in, then you're doing pretty well.
Obviously, we arrived at this place where we were really fascinated by maximal gains. Marginal gains, it definitely has its place, right? It's exciting. It's very specific to elite teams. Marginal gains is talking about how if you are already an elite performer, you have to make very small 1% gains, incremental gains. How do I add 1% on and 1% on and 1% on? But you have to already be a very high level performer. And I think my frustration has been, certainly for me, most of the teams that I work with aren't elite teams, because that's just life. Most people aren't elite. We're okay. And the concept of marginal gains works at a point that you're already high performance. There is no point if you're a beginner team, if you've never played doubles before, if you're learning to ride a bike, having a 1% improvement gain on not being able to ride without stabilizers isn't going to help anyone. For most teams, maximal gains is the thing that we need to look for. And these are probably going to be simple. They're probably going to be basic. They should be things that are appropriate to every team. It's great that there are books about high performance teams and elite athletes and special forces. But for most teams, there are probably things that they can do just like what you talked about in doubles, which aren't rocket science, but a good hygiene. So trying to let people in okay teams, in good enough teams, help them understand what they can do to be better as team members, not as managers, not as leaders, but as people in the team. How do I identify what those maximal gains are?
Yeah, and I think you put it brilliantly. The important thing, I suppose, within all of that is to say maximal gains is not the second-class citizen to marginal gains. You said it's part of the same continuum. A lot of the elite examples that you've given that you would naturally go to if you're thinking about good team performance, they've all gone through the maximal gains bit already. And a lot of their disciplines maintain and sustain the benefits of those maximal gains on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis, to the point that they're enabled to focus on the marginal. But I guess what you were saying is that maybe the frustration that some teams might experience is that it's quite bewitching to hear about these tiny details that are focused on at an elite level and think, well, in order to be like them, we're going to start doing that. And instead of saying, I think it's better to pay some attention to some actual, but like me do to death the metaphor of tennis, but it's the person who hears that, Nadal is playing in Madrid, which is a high altitude tournament, so he strings his rackets at a higher tension, so he increases the control he has with the ball because the air is thinner. And that someone going, okay, well, I'm playing in East Kilbride next week, which is slightly high up, so I'm going to string my rackets at higher tension.
Yeah, you don't want to be string tension guy.
No. You don't want to be.
We've discussed this. We've discussed this before. When I started climbing, it was like I needed every pair of climbing shoes. But it's like the maximal gain was look at your feet when you put them on a hold.
Yeah, and I think it's fine being string tension guy, right? You can do that, and there's no if it makes you happy and it gives you more, gives you a sense of involvement in tennis and so on. That's brilliant. But
and joy, just joy.
Yeah, fine, good, but thinking about it from a performance point of view. I know we're talking about individual performance now. It's just the same metaphor. If you're obsessing about string tension and you spent your time taking your rackets to get them restrung 3 times a week, but that stopped you having enough time to maybe do like a warm up before you play tennis, or you don't give attention to things like warm up, so you don't do a warm up. I'd be saying, well, warming up the tool that you're going to really use to produce your performance, which is your body, the marginal difference that a couple of pounds of string tension is going to make compared to actually being low risk of injury and more flexible and having muscles that are firing, there's an obvious difference. But I think a lot of people fall into that camp of, warm up,
Totally.
or whatever it
Yeah.
might be. In team context and organizations, think of the conversation we had with Susie Hamilton in this series, which is people expressing frustration that we have to have team meetings regularly. Oh, what's the point of this? What's the value of this? But that's an example. It's kind of a bit like a warm up in sport. Well, you got to go.
Totally.
You mentioned it's a hygiene factor. You got to go through it. And these, in my opinion, lead to sometimes unsung, slightly hidden gains, but the gains that they represent, the level of performance that they sustain is proportionately a lot more than your equivalent of mucking about with your string tensions.
We see it in industry all the time. People focus on the technical skills. It was very, very similar, but much lower risk or lower impact than what you were talking about with the hospitals. People will focus on the technical skills. We recruit for the technical skills, and we do very little training. And you mentioned Susie, whose interview. So Susie's the Veterans Commissioner and ex-Royal Navy. She made it sound very implicit, the training that they did, and we pushed her on. Can you be more explicit about what it is? And actually, it's way more so than it is in industry, where actually talking to a team about how they should communicate, act with each other, set goals, those things are often not trained at all. It really is implicit. It's just assumed that people will culturally adapt to that. And even very junior people aren't trained.
I do think there's something to do with a very basic human level, which is the vast majority of the evolutionary adaptation that our brains have made is directly related to us operating as interdependent beings, forming coalitions, collaborating, teamworking. A lot of our evolutionary adaptation relates to those capacities. They're very difficult things to do. So you could say it's quite hard. But I also think there's a thing about the learning gap in a context where you're selected for technical expertise and you're confronted with this dimension in your work that you're not good at naturally, you've not been trained at. There is a learning gap that exists there for you and your colleagues. It's quite a natural human response to be kind of protective against that and be like, no, it's the technical that counts, because I don't want to have to engage with my weaknesses, engage with my insecurities, engage with my lack of capacity to operate effectively as a team. And I don't necessarily get enough training to do it. And I think the interesting counterpoint to that is like marriages. So what I find is that you're talking about your tech context, very highly technical work, selected in for that expertise. Now you need to work as a team. That's the dimension that's troublesome, the relationship dimension. That teams are a mixture of task and relationship interdependence. It's the relationship interdependence that a lot of those teams really have. They've got some gains to make in it, if you want to put it in those terms. And the counter example is marriages, because you're together by virtue of the relationship interdependence. Like you got together as it forming a relationship, and then you get married. You've created a contract of being contractually interdependent, and you've got to run households. You've got to deal with finances. You've got to raise a family potentially. You've got to plan holidays. You've got to deal with other members of your respective families. There are a lot of technical aspects that come along with a romantic relationship that aren't implicit within how you formed as a couple. And they're the growing pains, I think, sometimes in marriages is, well, the relationship is sort of taken for granted because, well, that's why you got to know each other in the first place. Now we have to decide how we manage our bank accounts. How do we plan our diaries so that we can both do our hobbies, or where are we going on holiday and do we agree on it? And the processes that you develop to manage that stuff, that's the new bit. A team is a mixture, as I say, of task and relationship interdependence. And that's why we spend a lot of time focusing on teamwork, what to do with teamwork, around about relationship and those dynamics, because very often task and technical skills are somewhat implicit. I think we have something to learn from non-traditional examples like couples. Incidentally, there has been the suggestion that the Mars missions, one of the ways to confront the challenge of sending people off into deep space in complete isolation, out of contact, hundreds of millions of kilometers away from Earth, is to send couples.
I can already see that the book 2 in the series is Teamcraft for couples.
Yeah, but it's an interesting thought experiment, right? It's to say, why do we select for technical skills when probably the biggest challenge that they're going to face psychologically is on the basis of relationships? And although, loads of romantic relationships don't work out, but there's a degree of investment in the relationship that would not naturally exist if you put them together on the basis of technical skills. So it's an interesting thought experiment, at least.
And on that thought experiment, I think it's probably time for the quickfire round, which I know you've really enjoyed giving all of our guests throughout the series. So I'm hoping you're ready. You should be prepared for this. You've thought through your answers. They're deeply intellectual.
Yeah, I think so.
You don't seem convinced. So, Dr. Andrew MacLaren, your first quickfire question is, what are your team red flags?
My team red flags are passive aggression, manipulation, and threats, especially passive threats. So I kind of see it boils down to transparency and candor. I think even if you've got serious problems, if you're not willing to, or you don't feel safe to present those as they are, and you resort to or revert to manipulative sorts of behavior, that's a terrible sign because it boils down to manipulation. But yeah, they would be my team red flags.
And what is your best team experience?
Reflecting on it, I think this is probably one of the experiences that I could cite as having been foundational to my genuine interest in teamwork. And it happened a long time ago. I hadn't yet left school when I got a job in a local restaurant. My plan was I wanted to work in hospitality. I wanted to work in hotels, and there's a local restaurant that was hiring. So I went for the job at 17, I think I was. No, I was definitely 17 because I remember I wasn't allowed to serve alcohol. That was a problem. And it was a small restaurant, ex-army chef. Again, I think there's these are some of the seeds of my interest in teamwork because Alan, who was the chef and owner, had been in the army. I still have the best memories from working in that team. And that was so, I mean, I went on to I was Alan's best man at his wedding, great friends with him. Even after he eventually moved on and moved to Ireland. It was a small restaurant. There's 25 covers, so 25 guests that the restaurant could hold. It was aiming for a Michelin star, so kind of fine dining, Scottish food. And it was Alan and a sous chef and a kitchen porter in the kitchen, me and another waiter. But there was a team of 5 of us. And I suppose I worked in there more or less full time as well for a few years. And yeah, it was everything that you think is great about teamwork, camaraderie, going through highs and lows, really difficult customers, great nights, big successes. We won Alan won Restaurant of the Year 1 year for Scotland. And, you were a bit like some of our guests have said, especially, the armed forces guests. We weren't living together, but in a restaurant, you do work long hours together, and there's the long prep. And I also did stuff in the kitchen as well. I was wanting to learn stuff for the kitchen, so I would help out in kitchen prep and things. So you could spend be in from the morning, spend the whole day, have an hour off, then come back and get ready for service and be in service till midnight, 1 a.m, and then we'd sit and have drinks. And especially after a Saturday service, we'd have some drinks and party. And I have so many memories of that period, but just it all taken together, it was a genuine team. We pulled through, we dealt with problems, we helped each other out. Everybody learned a lot, and we had a lot of laughs as well. I think humor is something that comes through in some of the people that we've interviewed for this series of Teamcraft, and humor was a huge part of that life in the restaurant, and I adored it, and made some friendships that are as strong today as they were 20 plus years ago.
And like so many of our other guests as well, you've chosen something that's quite early in your career. I find that absolutely fascinating, and I don't know whether that's just because of the individuals is it something about the age of the person, or is it just that's the nature of the jobs that you have? Then it would be difficult to pick those things apart, but there is definitely a trend that we tend to go back to the beginnings of our careers for the best teamwork.
I think that it's an imprinting thing. I think for sure it was for me in so many ways. It was just, I have such amazing memories of even silly things like, if I hear music that we used to play in the restaurant, I just feel so happy and nostalgic, just because I have such positive memories attached to that time, that atmosphere.
The last quickfire question is there something that you want to leave our audience with? So that could be a book, a podcast, an article, a TED Talk. But is there one thing that you want to share with the audience?
I think I would, because it has to be one thing, I would share. Got to choose one.
Yep, got to choose one.
Because it's I'm thinking of what would really give people an interesting insight into something I think is really important. And ironically, it's not specifically to do with teams, but it's to do with talk and communication, which is fundamental to my interest in teamwork. It's a really eye-opening, insightful, nicely written book, and it's by Professor Elizabeth Stokoe, and it's called Talk, the Science of Conversation. So it's more specific to do with talking. That to me is the thing that brings teams to life. So if you can read that thinking about teamwork, then that's great. But yeah, I would definitely share that. I just think it's a brilliant book, and for anybody who has maybe not spent a huge amount of time thinking about the influence that even one word can have on the direction of a conversation, read that book.
Great. That's fantastic. And we will, as always, link that out in the podcast notes so that everybody can find it. So thank you, Andrew. That was excellent. You're all done now. You can relax. And that's it for today's episode, where we got to hear so many fascinating insights from Andrew. Andrew's Pass It On resource was Talk, the Science of Conversation by Elizabeth Stokoe, which we'll link to in the show notes with other ways to follow Andrew. This is the final episode of Season 1 of the Teamcraft podcast series, and we'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for who you'd like us to talk to or topics you'd like us to cover in Season 2. Thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.